I wanted to touch base on these fights before we get to Monday's morning combat, where we'll dig into everything, but let's just state it plainly. Ryan Garcia and Devin Haney both had a disastrous night last night in Times Square in New York City. Now, for different reasons, we'll get to both of them. Let's start with Ryan Garcia, who to me had, I would argue, a much worse night than Devin Haney. And Devin Haney did not have a good one, but Ryan's, to me, is demonstrably worse. First of all, he lost. He loses a not quite wide, but pretty clear unanimous decision to Rolly Romero, of all people. And, credit where it is due. I did not think Rolly Romero had it in him. This is a guy who was able against Tank. He was doing fine until he got over-aggressive and he got stopped. But he looked terrible against Pitbull Cruz and even Barroso, who was an ancient man and was still tuning him up before there was obviously that very, very questionable stoppage in the end. And I just didn't think he had this in him, but credit to him, he absolutely did. In fact, the two big winners on the night were obviously Teofimo Lopez and Rolly Romero. And Rolly Romero did win, obviously in part because of what he had game planned around. He fought a very disciplined fight. He fought a very tactical fight. He had a clear answer in mind for that left hook of Ryan Garcia, which, no matter what else you want to say about Ryan Garcia, is still obviously a very potent weapon. He dropped Ryan Garcia in the second, and Garcia really never recovered after that. That's not necessarily why it was a bad night for Ryan Garcia, although losing to Rolly Romero when he was a massive favorite is certainly quite surprising and not very helpful. But to me, it's actually the bigger story involved. Ryan Garcia beat Devin Haney about a year ago this time in New York City at the Barclays Center in what was a very controversial, exciting, certainly kind of fight where he had the most insane pre-fight antics. He was obviously on substances, but probably both legal and illegal, just in terms of the recreational side. He pops positive afterwards for a performance-enhancing drug. Now, Ostarine, I've said this before and I'll say it again, Ostarine contamination in normal supplements that you buy over the counter is actually something that is a real threat that can happen. He does have some degree to that extent of plausible deniability, but there were questions this whole week about whether his physique, even moving up in weight, looked even close to the same, and you can make your own judgments about it. But what you can't say is that he looked anything like himself. Yes, credit to Rolly Romero for clearly having a good game plan and a good defense. And that had to have played a role in how that fight went. More to the point, in both the case of Devin Haney and Ryan Garcia, taking a year off with no real tune-up, although I guess this was supposed to be the tune-up, to be perfectly honest with you, that can obviously affect you as well. It's not one thing or the other. But if you pop positive for some level of performance-enhancing drug, even if you have a degree of plausible deniability, and even if there was some time off, and you come back at a better weight class, because remember, he missed weight, arguably intentionally last time, hitting that 143 mark. He goes up to a different weight class. Doesn't necessarily look exactly the same, although there's some interpretation about that. But then in the fight itself, just did almost nothing. Just didn't have the same verve, didn't have the same, it seemed to me, willingness to engage. He just looked like a cheap facsimile of the guy who fought Devin Haney last April. You can decide for yourself whether that's PED related, whether that's time off related, and clearly there's no denying, to an extent, it's Rolly related. Big shouts to Rolly Romero for what he was able to turn in last night. No question about it. But if you're going to have all of those things befall you, and then after the fight against Devin Haney, you're telling the entire world that the reason Haney got stopped all those times has nothing to do with PEDs. There is no argument that Haney's defense in that fight against Garcia last April was good. That's not the argument that I'm going to make here. But he looked like a fraction of himself last night. A fraction, a cheap imitation. It didn't even look anything close to what you saw the last time. I'm going to say it again. There's probably a number of explanations, but when you arrogantly, after popping positive for PEDs, even if there is some contamination, arrogantly spend the next year dismissing any kind of claim that it could have been anything, it had to be anything other than whatever that contamination meant, and then you go and lay an egg like that, I am sorry, but that is not only going to blow up in your face, but it's going to raise questions about all the things you've been saying for the last year. Also, it does appear relative to last April when Ryan was in a disastrous condition, it does appear that he is trying to live a more, quite literally, sober life. And I'm not even talking about whether there's even any PEDs involved. Just in terms of recreational drugs, it seems like he is in a better place. And all of that is great. But of course, let's not forget that he also spent a big part of after that fight saying not like modestly racist things, insanely racist things, insanely Islamophobic things, insanely homophobic things. I mean, going off in the most absurd of ways in all of this manic episodes he was having, to my mind, not making really any effort to make amends for it. Again, and aside from the fight itself, then arrogantly going around and saying, not my fault that Devin Haney can't defend a left hook. And then you look like that in a return fight where, I'm going to say it one more time, he was a monster favorite going into this for all the reasons we mentioned about some of the setbacks Rolly had been having. He has blown up, not by himself, we'll get to Devin in just a second, he has blown up whatever value the rematch was supposed to have between himself and Devin Haney as a consequence. Just not a flat performance, a terrible performance against a guy he was widely expected to beat after being defiant that the success he had against Devin Haney had anything other than the fact that he's just amazing. This was a disastrous showing by him, and not for nothing, even though he rebounded against Duarte, he had a terrible showing against Tank. He had a fight against Haney where he did drop Haney 3 times, but if you actually go back and look at the scoring, it was pretty close because Haney was able to rescue a bunch of rounds in the middle parts of that bout, and it's a no contest, and then he comes back, and then Rolly just straight up outboxed him. Ryan Garcia's got some real tough questions to answer about the state of his career and where it's all going to go. Not a good night for him. Not a good night for that victory lap he tried to take after the fight against Devin Haney. Not a good night for all the people who defended him for a year, echoing all of the nonsense that he was saying. And certainly my claim before the Haney fight against Garcia that Haney was going to tune him up like a guitar, that didn't age well, but perhaps now you can see why I did not have a high degree of confidence in Ryan Garcia. I was not a guy who ever saw tape on him and was like, oh, he's amazing. Now, again, I do think there are some skill issues that got Haney clearly in trouble in that fight against Garcia. It's not a one or the other kind of thing, but this fight to me was a better representation of who I think Ryan Garcia actually is as a boxer. And again, big questions for him to start answering. But that, of course, takes us to Devin Haney, who also had a terrible night. A horrible night. Now, in the end, it wasn't as bad as Ryan for the sole reason that he won, and he won a wide decision. It was never really close. You could probably score if you wanted maybe a couple of rounds for Ramirez, but in general, Haney won that one. But I just want to point this out. Look at this tweet from Dan Canobio. It wasn't just the Haney and the Ramirez fight. There's some other ones, but look at the Haney and Ramirez fight. One of the lowest outputs in the history of CompuBox. There was actually 2 of these fights on this card, but look at that. Look at that. That is absolutely insane. Devin Haney looked like damaged goods. He did not look like he was fully recovered. Now, again, same thing I'm going to say about Ryan Garcia. It's not just one thing. In Garcia's case, it was Romero who had a good showing. It was the time off. And certainly in the case of Devin Haney, that time off, I think, also probably affected him as well. I don't think it's one thing or the other. But this entire fight, again, where he was a monster favorite, was designed for him to look good, not just to set up a fight against Ryan Garcia down the line. Both of them were supposed to get a win last night, and then they move on and do the rematch, and it was supposed to be quite big. And again, Garcia blew it up, and I think even with a win, Haney totally blew it up. It wasn't just about setting up that subsequent fight. It was about kind of being a bit of a showcase for Haney. The guy who fought kind of nip and tuck with and beat Lomachenko, the guy who has shown flashes of brilliance at times, the guy who had forged his own destiny, the guy who was building a big name for himself. He was supposed to try and win back, I think, some of the fans, restore some, put some energy into his collapsed stock, which came out of that Garcia fight last April. It was just supposed to be something of a rehabilitative effort. And it didn't do that at all. In fact, if anything, it made people, I don't know if they got more soured on him, but maybe even that. They certainly did not come around to anything that he was trying to do in that fight. Historically bad fight. Historically terrible, terrible fight. One of the worst fights, and I'm not even... guys, I watch fights for a freaking living, and I hated the way that Devin Haney was treated after the Ryan Garcia fight, even if I grant he brought some of that stuff on himself. But you turn in a performance like that, and you are not going to help yourself at all. He looked terrible. He looked frightened. He looked unwilling to exchange. He looked unwilling to really step on the gas at all. Getting a win was important, and I'm going to say this again. When someone has a long layoff, in the case of Garcia and in the case of Haney, it might take a few fights to get some of that back. It might take a few fights to really kind of get going again. So we can't fully write him off. But for a fight that was supposed to set up the Garcia rematch and for a fight that was supposed to build back his stock, restore confidence, it literally did none of that. And in fact, it may have hurt almost all of those efforts. We'll have to see as time goes on, but he did himself no favors last night. Nothing. Again, one more time, against a guy he was widely expected to beat. And I'll say this too, though. You guys know my opinion about PEDs. I'm not as bothered by them in sport. Garcia does have some plausible deniability claims. That's not me saying I agree with him, but again, ostarine is one of the most common contaminants in sports supplementation and various other forms as well. Of course, there's also a PED. You can use it in that way too. But the point I want to make was Devin Haney sued Ryan Garcia after that fight, which, again, was bad for PR. I mean, there's no denying it really messed him up in terms of how the public perceived him. But I don't know, folks. Maybe he had a point. The guy, it appears, intentionally missed weight, certainly was totally unprofessional against Haney in the lead up to that fight last April, then goes out there and does what he does. And again, I don't think it's one thing or the other. Devin Haney had bad defense in that fight, and that also played a role. But then you pop positive afterwards. You're defiant about it. Then he shows back up here, Garcia, a year later, and looks like barely recognizable compared to what he was last April. If you're Devin Haney and you feel like you were wronged and there is at least some evidentiary weight on your side, the commission's going to suspend him and not do much else. And then the world is cheering him. What recourse do you have at that point? It's not me saying I fully endorse the lawsuit. It's really not that. I'm just asking, did he need to get killed in the media for it? Oh, you're not supposed to sue a guy who beat you. Yeah, but look what he did. Or at a bare minimum, look what you can credibly accuse him of doing. And now look at the aftermath a year later. Haney doesn't look like himself. Garcia doesn't look like himself. Should the world really have beaten up Devin Haney for that? Seems to me the guy who plausibly missed weight on purpose, plausibly used PEDs, plausibly was defiant about it the entire time, and then comes back and looks like an absolute barely recognizable cheap facsimile of it, and the world cheered him on for it. I don't know, folks. I don't know. I don't know that Devin Haney's lawsuit is so out of bounds in a world where your competitor blatantly, credibly, in terms of accusations here, credibly has an argument that they cheated in numerous different ways, and the world seemingly endorsed it. I don't know. I'm literally saying to you, I don't know if that's the worst thing I've ever seen from a fighter. Whereas the reaction in real time when he did it was like, oh my God, it's the most terrible thing. But either way, he did do it, and it absolutely torched his relationship to the fans. And so that's why last night was supposed to be the get back fight. That's why last night was supposed to be the one where he, I'm not going to say fixed everything, but kind of put it behind him. It seemed to me both of those guys, Ryan Garcia and Devin Haney, for different reasons, they were still haunted by April 2024. Rather than this being a pivot away from that, rather than this being like a let's move on from it, all it did was show us that they were both still living in the shadow of that fight. And now, I'm not saying if they fight, it won't do some numbers, but whatever it was going to do, if they had just fought last night or whatever happened last night wasn't going to happen, like some kind of interference hadn't been run, whatever that fight was going to be, the rematch, it was going to be huge. I don't know what it'll be. I'm not here to tell you it'll be nothing, but it won't be what it was. There's no question about that. Now, there's a bigger conversation to be had about that event in Times Square and how it looked and, the like. That we can get to that on MK, but holy crap. Teofimo Lopez looked great. Rolly Romero fought disciplined, fought smart. Shouts to both of them, although, there's issues with both of those guys too. But in terms of like the fights and the fighters themselves, they did their job. But Garcia did not. And Haney, I just don't know what that was. I really don't know what that was. I don't know how you classify that other than he does not appear to be the same guy. My hope for his sake is this was an early turn of the screw, and subsequent ones he'll look a little smoother, a little more ready, a little more willing to go. But man, the ghosts of April 2024 are haunting both of those guys, and you saw them both end up getting quite affected by it last night in Times Square. More analysis and discussion about this on Monday's MK. I'll see you all then.